Good evening. Good evening. My name is Michaël Neuman. I'm the head of Crash, and I'll be the co-moderator with Caroline Izambert, who's also a friend of mine. I'll introduce her briefly. She a former professor of history, teacher of history. She's the head of a public health unit at the city of Paris, and she's a member of the scientific committee of Crash, and she's been working with us for many years. In 2018, she was invited here as a speaker for her thesis on the health of migrant foreigners living in France. And so she's worked a lot with MSF and Médecins du Monde. And we both have great interest in Frantz Fanon, and we thought it would be interesting to moderate this debate together. So Adam is a journalist. He's American. He's from Brooklyn, from New York. He speaks perfect French. So he will be switching from French into English. He's the US editor for the London Review of Books, and he has contributed to the New York Times Magazine, New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and others. He's also a Bard College fellow professor, so he's a university professor. We've known each other for quite some years now. He's also a friend of mine. So when he talked to me about this book, we both decided that it would be interesting to present it to you here at MSF. Adam has been working a lot on the Middle East for many years, Algeria, and also at the crossroads of Algeria and the Middle East. You'll find Fanon, and we'll come back to that later. See, he works a lot on jazz music. That's another good reason why we're good friends. But we're not going to talk about jazz music. But at one point in the book, there is mention of the fact that Fanon did like jazz music. So why Frantz Fanon? So as I said, Caroline, Adam, and I said it would be interesting to share this book with you tonight. The book was published both in French and English in between February and March earlier this year. So this is the English version, this is the French version, and this is the American version. No, you have what you want. Other translations are underway. We'll come back to that probably later. But when we read this book, we realized that there were many, many items that seemed to be echoing our current times and our internal debates at MSF, that is practicing medicine. And we'll come to that because Fanon was a medical doctor, but also a psychiatrist with very interesting psychiatric procedures and practices that can be echoed at what we're doing at MSF. There's the question of identity that is very present in his works and his life. Decolonization, we know how important this question is in the context of the war in Gaza, but also this is what we've discussed internally at MSF for many years, decolonization, and the question of violence. Violence is at the heart of the concerns of MSF as well, and violence not as something that would be conceptual or abstract, but rather from this viewpoint of Fanon, violence is resulting in having an impact on people or those who generate violence and those who are the victims of violence. So maybe that's where Fanon can help us understand the situations. In the French-speaking world, Fanon is not discussed that much, maybe much more amongst the intellectuals in the Anglo-Saxon world. But after the attacks of October 7, his name was also mentioned as the one suggesting the theory of national liberation. I will not tell more about what Fanon was said, what was said about Fanon, but you know, he kind of was resuscitated as the one proposing a theory for national liberation. For all these reasons, and before I give the floor to Adams as soon as possible, I thought it would be interesting to review the life of Fanon as an intellectual and as an activist, and discuss it with the author, taking advantage of his presence in Paris. This book is absolutely great. I will strongly recommend that you buy it, borrow it in the local library, and borrow it from friends and read it. And if you browse on the internet, you will find many articles in the English-speaking magazines and press and French-speaking press of interviews of Adam that will help you to have a more complete picture of the situation and better understand what's to be discussed. No, some technical aspects. This conference is streamed, it's online, it's being recorded, it's available on the internet, meaning that even though the camera shows our three faces, it might also be filming you. So if you don't want to be on the film, on the stream, you might sit not close to the cameras. There is simultaneous interpretation for this conference, and I would like to thank the interpreters who are in the back of the room. And I will ask the speakers and Adam not to speak too fast so that they can perform their work as best as they can. I would like to thank them. They're quite often the same interpreters working with us, and also a great thank to Joël, who is in charge of all the technical assistance to make this possible. And thank you to all of you for being here with us today. While some people are demonstrating in the streets and it's very hot outside. Caroline, you have the floor.
Peut-être pour commencer de façon assez simple, je pense que dans la salle, il doit y avoir des grands connaisseurs.
Well, I'm sure that in this room, some people are very knowledgeable of Fanon, but maybe some people don't know him. So maybe, Adam, you can tell us briefly about who was Fanon and outline his personality. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you, Michaël. He's been a close friend for many years, and Caroline, whom I've just met. And thank you for being with us tonight. He was born in Martinique in 1925. He grew up in Fort-de-France. At the age of 19, he joined the French resistance movement, and he escaped from Martinique to join the Force de la France Libre in Morocco. So he was injured during the war. He was awarded with Croix de Guerre. Salon was the general who gave him his Croix de Guerre, while Salon was in favor of French Algeria and ended up as being the enemy of Fanon in Algeria. Fanon studied psychiatry in Lyon after the Second World War, and he went for a residence or internship in the Saint-Alban Hospital, a very innovative psychiatry hospital, while François Tosquelles, a Catalan psychiatrist, organized all the psychiatric services in the Spanish Republic induced a kind of revolution in psychiatry, which was called sociotherapy or institutional psychiatry. There was also Paul Bolvet and Lucien Bonafé, who were communists and psychiatrists. In Saint-Alban, there were Trotskyist and communist psychiatrists. In Spain, they would fight each other, but they were friends in Saint-Alban. And in 1953, 1 year after the publication of his book, the first book, Black Skin, White Masks, a very relevant book on racism and the psychological consequences of racism on black people, but also on white people, Fanon was appointed in Blida, in Algeria. He was the director of the psychiatric hospital in Blida, Joinville. And 11 months after his arrival in Algeria, the war started. And Fanon wanted to join the ALN, that is the Liberation Army of Algeria. Unfortunately, didn't become a soldier, joining the independent movement of Algeria. But he had a kind of underground psychiatric hospital where he treated both the victims of tortures and those who perpetrated those tortures. And he wrote a lot on this topic in his last book, The Wretched of the Earth, particularly in the last chapter on mental disorders and colonial wars. And 3 years after his arrival in Algeria, he had to leave the country. Otherwise, he would have been arrested by the French military. He could have been tortured or even killed. And instead of going back to Martinique and instead of practicing medicine in France, he decided to go to Tunisia. Tunis was, at that time, the capital city, was hosting the provisional government of the future Algerian Republic, and he became the spokesperson of FLN. 2 years later, he was appointed as an all-purpose ambassador for Algeria in Africa. He went to Accra. He traveled throughout Africa for FLN. He wrote a book on the War of Algeria, which was published in 1959 and confiscated by the French police. And in 1961, he died of a severe leukemia. He died in the United States, the country that he called the country of lynchers. But in order to try and understand his work, and I forgot to mention that his masterpiece book, The Wretched of the Earth, was published 2 days before his death in Washington. One has to add that his life starts in a way or another after he died, because he was rather well known by the leftist movement and those who were carrying the suitcases in France, as they were called, and who were pretty much concerned about the former French colonies and what was happening in Algeria. And it's really after his death that he was seen as a hero, as the theory master for anti-colonial movement, the Black Panthers, the Palestinians who read him in Arabic. The book was translated in Beirut in Arabic in 1964. And he was also a source of inspiration for the revolutionaries in South Africa. Lucas Cabral was a great reader of Fanon, and later in the 1980s, 1990s, he was rediscovered as a philosopher. You know, as a writer of the French theory. And I'll stop there. So it gives you an idea of his life. Quite a feat to summarize such a rich life in a short time. At MSF, we are medical doctors, so maybe would like to hear you more. Tell us about Fanon as a psychiatrist and his practice in Blida in Algeria. Well, I should have said that he was pretty much engaged in many debates on identity, on negritude. When he was a young student, he was very close to the ideas of Léopold Sédar Senghor, and later he was closer to Aimé Césaire, who was also one of the founders of negritude, but whose ideas were not so essentialist, while the Sédar Senghor's thoughts was more mystical, was more about race and African identity. He was pretty much also involved in debating with Jean-Paul Sartre, and he wrote some critics and criticized Sartre, and he also praised Sartre, and Sartre was pretty much influenced by Fanon himself. And as you know, Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre, wrote the famous preface of the Rich of the Earth. And you're right in saying that he was a psychiatrist, and that psychiatry was absolutely key in his intellectual process on the way he considered politics, physical and mental suffering, violence, and in his practice, he was quite innovative. He took the ideas of François Tosquel, Balvet, and Bonafé, and he transformed these ideas, this concept. He was not the one who invented the concept. I remember that Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, in their book on philosophy, said that philosophy is the invention of concepts. And in that sense, he was not a philosopher, but he took some concept invented by others and shed a new light on these concepts. He transformed them and made them like creolized. And he took some ideas of institutional psychiatry and made it anti-colonial, and talked about racial alienation of the people in the French West Indies. And that's what he wrote in his first book, Black Skin, White Masks. And this concept of the alienation is a concept that he applied to the condition of colonized people in Algeria.
Adam, can you tell us more about Fanon's daily practice in psychiatry, the fact that he treated the soldiers, the fighters of the Algerian National Liberation Front, as well as their opponents and torturers? In St. Alban Hospital, the psychiatrists tried to recreate the customs and living environment of the alienated. He wanted to create sort of a micro-society to integrate back the alienated, the mad people, in their usual daily life. And when he got to Algeria, he tried to do the same. But at the beginning, he set up a sort of experiment. He opened up a movie theater, a cinema, and a theater. He introduced many new things in the hospital of Blida-Joinville, just in order to reintegrate the residents of that hospital and make them feel better. You had Muslim people, roughly 200, that he was in charge of, that was about 200 European women. And he found that concerning European women, the techniques of institutional therapy worked very well, and that European women treated there managed to have again a joie de vivre. They began enjoying life again. They would go and watch movies and so on. However, the Muslim man did not react well to that form of treatment. And a doctor who was not radical, as Fanon was, could have said, well, I tried and it didn't work. And a whole apparatus around him would have supported this thesis. Fanon was not only a practitioner of psychiatry, he was also a fierce critic of psychiatry. His first paper on psychological alienation of the colonized was written in France. He described the so-called African syndrome. He worked on that. He was working as a doctor in Lyon with North African workers, blue collars, who were complaining about physical symptoms that he could not really identify. He couldn't find the cause or a lesion that could explain that. And the French doctors at the time made a diagnosis. Well, they created a category of diagnosis to find explanations. It was the so-called African syndrome, and they thought either those workers are just lazy or they're crazy. They think they're sick. But for Fanon, he saw that as the expression of racial and colonial suffering that explained the condition these men suffered from. France told these men, you're French, but in actuality, the reality was that they were not even second category citizens. They were less than that. So Fanon was very much aware of that problem. Even before he got to Algeria, he published that paper back in 1951 or 52, before he got to Algeria. And even if he didn't arrive in Algeria with the figure of this anti-colonial revolutionary man, he was acutely aware of that issue, and he was very sensitive to the fact that the French doctors totally ignored and did not understand the suffering of those Algerian men. Instead of saying, I cannot do anything for those men from Algeria, he decided to create what a Mauresque cafe, where all the Muslims in Blida-Joinville hospital could come and have coffee together, as they would have in their town or village of origin. He also invited the Mufti to come along for the very first time to the hospital. He also had a music group coming to play Arabic and Andalus music. And he got the same results with those Muslim men as he did with non-Muslim French patients. When he wrote about that experiment, he wrote, in order to practice psychiatry in a correct fashion in a colonial context, you have to apply a relativist concept of culture. You cannot arrive with a concept of universalism. Caroline Izambert. What about the use of electroshocks, electrotherapy? That may appear as a contrast with the innovative practice of psychiatry by Fanon. You're right. That's probably a mistake he made. He did believe in electroshock therapy, and he used this technique throughout his short life. It is a bit shocking, if I may say. You know, he would not question all the psychiatrist practices of the time, and he was very innovative in some aspects, while in others he was pretty conventional and traditional, actually. Jean Calfa, who co-published the volume of Fanon's writings on alienation and freedom, he suggested in an essay that for Fanon, violence was violent, but it was a therapy. So Fanon believed in violence as a therapy. And in my book, I didn't want to put under the carpet some disturbing aspects of Fanon's psychiatric practices or his political decisions or his writings. He was an extremely complex man, sometimes disturbing. And he really embodied the political future of his discipline, the political future, but he also embodied a form of the past that we managed to overcome. Caroline Izambert. Well, the question that comes next, and which is at the core of all that, is anti-colonial violence and the fact that it can be justified, explained, and celebrated. And at the time, that was the most striking example of what people took from him. Yeah, it's a mix of explanation and celebration. It's not solely the celebration of anti-colonialism. I would say it is not the core question, but it cannot be avoided because it is very important. I agree. Yet I'm struck by the fact that when speaking of Sartre, for example, we don't have to speak all the time about violence, even though the preface written by Sartre to The Wretched of the Earth is much more violent than Fanon's text. Sartre, in the preface, explains that for the colonized, killing the colonizer is acceptable, but Fanon never wrote such a thing in his book. And I wonder why all that. In my view, it has to do with the race of Fanon. Now, I'm not suggesting that people asking questions about his support to violence are motivated by racism, and yet you have that cliche about the black man being violent. And in his first book, Black Skins, White Masks, Fanon writes that in this imaginary world, the black man represents biology, rational pulsions, and drives and violence. And in my view, That's why the question of violence is like a fetish in Fanon's work. He wrote 2 chapters on violence in The Wretched of the Earth. In the first chapter, it's a eulogy to violence, and the other chapter raises many questions. The last chapter, mental disorders and colonial disorders. And he writes, maybe this chapter doesn't make sense for some readers, and yet I have to address those key issues. And in that chapter, Fanon wrote that the colonized, I'll start again, sorry, says Adam. Okay, he speaks of the fighters fighting colonialism and who are haunted by the acts of violence they committed during the anti-colonial revolution. For example, he speaks of an African soldier after independence who every year, when comes the anniversary of his operation, he placed a bomb that killed several people, and he's still haunted by the possibility that this operation killed people who were close to his European friends, who were anti-colonialism. So when you read this chapter, you don't get the feeling that violence in itself may create a new man, a new human being, which comes as a suggestion in the first chapter and certainly in Sartre's preface. So what does Fanon say in this first chapter? He focuses on the psychological effect of violence on the minds of the colonized. Violence comes as a counter-violence, first of all. It's a form of violence that targets the violence of the colonial domination. Fanon wrote about one of the most violent anti-colonial movement in the century. French Algeria was the epitome of that during the first 3 decades of colonization that the French called the conquest or pacification of Algeria, as the French would call it. Algeria lost nearly 1/3 of its population due to violence, diseases, or fires, like some Algerian fighters, after they found a refuge in some shelters, the French soldiers would set fire to those shelters, and they were burned in their caves. And the Algerians first tried to use peaceful solutions. They set up nationalist parties, but not going to war. They just wanted to be awarded French nationality for some of them. You had liberal Islamo-Arab parties, reformist parties. But they were always faced with fierce opposition by the French settlers, and the French government was an accomplice to that, and didn't do anything against the obstination of the French settlers and European settlers in Algeria. So for Fanon, anti-colonial violence was a necessity, a political necessity. And it was the decision of Algerian independentists who started the war on November 1st, 1954. But for Fanon, the benefits of violence were not only practical but psychological as well. For Frantz Fanon, as a doctor, the colonized is a totally powerless individual who suffers from sheer despair, a sense of fatalism weighing on him, preventing him from acting or expressing his own feeling of aggressiveness. Fanon was quite influenced by the writings of Adler, the psychiatrist. Adler, who emphasized the centrality of aggression more than sexuality, which pertains more to the circle of Freud in Berlin. So psychologically, violence was necessary for the colonized. But if you read carefully this first chapter, you also find some reservations. For example, Fanon writes that in the early stages of anti-colonial fighting, for the colonized, by definition, the colonizer is the existential enemy. And that's why at the beginning of the uprising against colonialism, you always systematically have mass killings and massacres and bloodbaths, such as the massacre in Philippeville in 1955 that Fanon called the point of no return in the Algerian Revolution. But he also writes that at some point, the insurgents, the rebels against colonialism, should understand that they can also find allies amongst the Europeans, and they should conceive a more universalist project. And some colonized, on the other hand, could be their enemies. Fanon wrote that hatred and the desire, however legitimate, of violence, borrowing a sentence from Sartre, the anti-racist racism cannot fuel the anti-colonial revolution. It's not that Fanon became against violence, became an opponent to violence, but Fanon clearly understood that violence is not the ultimate goal of revolution, and that the revolution should achieve a more universal political project and not so much focused on identity. So in my view, the vision of Fanon on violence is much more complex and ambiguous than we believe.
No, since the October 7th, in various places, including in France, Fanon was used to justify violence and massacres. Now, based on what you've just said, how do you perceive this mobilization, even though we're not going to resuscitate Fanon from the death and ask him his opinion? But what is your view on, Fanon being back on stage, so to speak, because of the current situation? I will be answering in English to this question.
I'm sorry, but I don't want to be misunderstood on this. I think it's understandable that Fanon was invoked after October 7. obviously he was a supporter of armed struggle, and the attacks of October 7 by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups did represent a new and much more organized phase of the Palestinian armed struggle that can't be denied, and moreover, I do think that it is also entirely understandable, one, that after 16, 17 years of being suffocated by the blockade, by the denial of national and human rights, the dehumanization that Palestinians as a whole have suffered, and that Gazans have suffered probably more than any other Palestinians, that there would be a resumption of the armed struggle. As far as the form that it took, I'll get to that in a moment. But Fanon always emphasized that the oppression and violence of settler colonialism would inevitably generate a violent reaction on the part of the colonized. It's not an idea that is exclusive to Fanon, of course, but he made that point very eloquently, and his writing is filled with catchphrases. I mean, in a sense, that's Fanon also suffers from this, because it's very easy to reduce Fanon's understanding of the dynamics of violence to a phrase such as the colonized person liberates himself in and through violence. Fanon did write that, but of course he wrote that in the context of a very complex Hegelian argument that is much richer than a single line. But particularly in this age of social media, when a James Baldwin or a Frantz Fanon can be reduced to a set of catchphrases, I'm not surprised that he was invoked. And I also want to say that I understand entirely why most Palestinians, particularly in the early days, just after October 7, before it became clear that October 7 had also involved mass atrocities against civilians, I also understand why it is that so many Palestinians were ecstatic, because finally someone had actually done something, and someone had, I mean, and it's gruesome to say, but it's also, I think it's a normal human reaction in the abnormal situation that Palestinians live in, to give the Israelis a taste of their own medicine. Fanon writes that the colonized person is a persecuted man who dreams constantly of becoming the persecutor. I mean, what happened on October 7 is that the persecuted person became the persecutor, and I mean, to the point, even as we know, of filming the atrocities, to advertise them, and to provoke fear and consternation and anxiety among Israelis. Fanon, also wrote, of course, that the truth in an anti-colonial war is purely a product of politics. It's not really a matter of what happened, but how it gets interpreted by the two different forces in an extremely Manichaean situation. And certainly one of the purposes of the of the Hamas attack was to create an absolute polarity between Israelis and Palestinians, and essentially to say from now on, the only language is the language of force. As I mentioned, the Palestinian, there was an understandable euphoria because Palestinians have long felt that the Palestinian Authority is not only an illegitimate entity, but that it's a corrupt one, that it's a gendarme of the Israelis, that it's done nothing to advance their national aspirations. And so Hamas appears to have been the one group that is willing to take these, dramatic risks and to enter into the fight, since peaceful means appeared to have failed, whether security cooperation with the Israelis practiced by the Palestinian Authority, or for that matter, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which has practiced a politics of shaming Israel, but which has been of limited effectiveness. And so now, having said that, I don't want to suggest that Fanon would necessarily have embraced the attacks. I think it would be, first of all, it's impossible to say, and it's even, I think, remarkable that we're having this conversation because in Fanon's entire body of work, there are only 3 references to Israel-Palestine. In fact, I would go further than that. There are only 3 references to Israel because there are no references to Palestinians in Fanon's work. He died in 1961. The French left, of which, whether he would have wished to be considered this or not, he was a part. The French left, aside from a few solitary figures such as Maxime Rodinson and Jacques Berck, was unaware of the Palestinian question. Fanon certainly would have known something about it because of his, of his contacts with the FLN. Palestine had actually been quite important to the Algerian national struggle, really since the 1930s. There's a whole body of scholarship on this matter. Messali Haj, the founding father of the Algerian independence struggle, was very preoccupied with Palestine in the 1930s, but Fanon said nothing about it. His only references to Israel in his writing concern questions of post-war reparations and whether this model might be applied to former colonies. So for that reason, it's rather extraordinary that we're even talking about Fanon in Palestine. And I've had the very strange experience of being accused of sanitizing of Fanon and of somehow neutralizing his radicalism when I've suggested that it's not clear that Fanon would have endorsed the strategies adopted by Hamas and other armed groups on October 7. But the fact is that in Fanon's book, A Dying Colonialism, L'enceinte de la Révolution algérienne, Fanon writes that that some Algerian soldiers have succumbed to the almost primordial brutality caused by colonial oppression, and have undertaken unjust acts. If you read Fanon in the last chapter, Colonial Warfare and Mental Disorders, he writes of rather horrific violence carried out by the FLN against European civilians. And he writes also of there's a rather notorious case of a child, a European child, who was killed by 2 Algerian Muslim friends because these 2 children had lost members of their own family to the French, and they wanted to carry out revenge, and so they decided to kill one of their best friends. Fanon is clearly horrified by this. So the notion that Fanon would have cheered on the slaughter at the music festival, or the very determined efforts to kill every last member of certain kibbutzes, I'm not convinced by that. I think Fanon would have understood, would have explained, would have diagnosed October 7, and to be sure, I think Fanon would have regarded the initial assault on the military barracks, and perhaps also the killing of soldiers, as a legitimate exercise in anti-colonial violence. But I'm personally not persuaded, based on what I've read of Fanon and based on the research that I've done, that he would have approved of the atrocities against civilians on that day. We'll never know, and I think that there is room for, let's say, interpretive combat. Fanon's writings are not they're not unified in that sense. They're not coherent. They're all sorts. I mean, let's recall that he wrote these standing up. He was in a room walking around, and his secretary, Marie-Jeanne Manuelon, would take his dictation. He had very little time to edit his work. He himself was a work in progress, and the idea that we should look to him on these questions as the final arbiter, I think, is very peculiar. He was a 36-year-old man when he died, and he himself was not someone to look for Sartre side master thinkers on whom to model himself. He was constantly revising his own thoughts and moving to new positions. And so I think that, we have to, when we read Fanon on violence, we need to read him, one, creatively, and two, with a sense of our own, I think, of our own ethical orientation. Does that answer your question?
Merci beaucoup, Adam.
Thank you very much, Adam. We'll give the floor to people here in the audience, in the room. Now, I'd like to come back to the question of universalism seen by Fanon. It's at the heart of many discussions. In France, it is certainly considered from a different standpoint in the United States. In your book, Fanon is portrayed as someone who is carrying some universalism and not the one supporting relativism. Since you know pretty well France, can you, shed your light on those who are the French supporters of French universalism, which is criticized for concealing the inequalities under the veil of universalism, while others would put more emphasis on defending some communities' interest? You may answer this question in English if you want to.
It's a great question, and it's difficult to answer, because although I do think that Fanon was a champion of a radical universalism, he was also very insistent on the irreducible specificity of lived experience, and the lived experience of different groups in a population is different and distinctive and has to be understood in its own terms. And so Fanon was certainly not among those who would argue that the way to overcome the legacy of racism and colonialism is to avoid talking about racism and colonialism and to accede to some nominally higher stage of colorblindness. I think he would have, found this to be utterly preposterous. He was certainly, in his own manner, a modernist. Whether he was a modernist in a very French European fashion, I think, is something that can be debated. But I don't think that he was a proponent of a cultural relativism that would lead to the acceptance or underwriting of limitations on people's freedom. And I'll just give one example because I think it's a widely misinterpreted essay. It's the essay called Algeria Unveiled in his 1959 book, Year 5 of the Algerian Revolution. It's an essay that's caused a lot of confusion because it has been read by some readers as almost an Islamist text or as a celebration of the Hayek. But in fact, it's a fascinatingly semiotic essay on the shifting meanings of the veil during an anti-colonial struggle. And in that essay, Fanon is writing about women, Algerian women, who become involved in the liberation struggle and who seek simultaneously to free themselves from colonialism and also to free themselves from patriarchy. And I think that Fanon was certainly getting at what you might call the phenomenological experience of these women in combat, many of whom really did think that they were freeing themselves as individual female subjects and not merely as colonized Algerians. A number of former Algerian fighters, female fighters, have paid homage to Fanon for accurately capturing what it felt like for them to take part in the struggle. So in that essay, Fanon writes of women who, for the first time, take off their Hayek and dress up as Europeans and leave the Kasbah and enter the European city and place bombs or hand messages to fighters, or they're given tasks and they go into the city. And he writes that their whole corporeal schema, it's a phrase that he takes from Merleau-Ponty, changes. They feel different. They feel they have a new sense of bodily freedom, moving through these European cities, but also undertaking these very dangerous missions. But then he writes of another stage that arrives sometime later in the struggle, where Algerian women begin to wear the veil again. And the backdrop to this wearing of the veil is the so-called unveiling ceremonies that the French army presided over in the streets of Algiers in 1958. There was a war of images going on between the FLN and the French army over which side would best protect the interests of Algerian women. And the French wanted to project themselves as a force of emancipation, in essence, freeing, to use a phrase of Gayatri Spivak, freeing brown women from brown men. And Fanon's argument was that revolution, not colonial modernization, would lead women to emancipation. In any case, he writes about these women who reassume the veil, and now the veil has a different meaning. Its new meaning is anti-colonial liberation and fighting against the forcible unveiling of these women in the streets. I mean, his argument here is that the veil no longer has the meaning that it had at the beginning of the anti-colonial struggle. At the beginning, its meaning was one of social conservatism, social ossification, right? Because Fanon argued that religious conservatism in Algeria was in part the effect of colonial de-development, that Algerians reasserted their relationship to tradition as a bulwark, as a protection against colonial intrusion. There's some, I think, some validity to this argument, although the Algerian historian Mohamed Harbi has also pushed against it. In any case, my point is that Fanon's argument here is not that the veil is bad or that the veil is good, but that the veil has to be understood, you know, dynamically within a set of contexts. But of course, you know, his main target in this essay is the colonial pretensions of emancipation by the French. And I don't want to suggest that that the ideology of républicanisme today, of the ideology of French homogeneity, is a purely colonial product. Obviously, this is a post-colonial era, not a colonial era. But I do think that there are traces of it today, and I do think that Fanon is perhaps a helpful guide in understanding the ways in which the vestiges of the colonial continue to persist in certain French attitudes towards difference, towards, you know, what the French call, you know, ostensible signs of difference. So yes, he is a universalist, but he believes that we have to pay attention to these histories and to these experiences of racism. A black person, you know, he argued in Black Skin, White Mask, experiences bodily suffering different from a white person. This was his argument with Jean-Paul Sartre. So I think that, you know, what Fanon wanted to do was to somehow forge a link between a radical existentialism that emphasized the concrete and these different lived experiences of oppression with the aspiration to a new universality that would not be contaminated by the colonial pretensions of the old one.
Many thanks again, Adam. Well, we've been discussing for a little over an hour. Maybe it's time to give the floor to the people in the room, and I have more questions as well, and so does Caroline, I'm sure. But what about you in the room? Any comments or observations? Thank you, Adam. It was very interesting, but you stole my first question. I have more questions, though. But yeah, cultural relativism, this notion pushes us to wonder about or ask questions about the notion of universalism, particularly when you're French. And, you know, universalism is like a big machine crushing everything that exists, and that's not it. There is a conflict between colonialism and universalism, and between universalism and anti-colonial struggle. It's really a core question. But focusing on more immediate concerns, what about treating the torturers, the executioners? That's very interesting. I'd like to hear your take on that. Because in a way, it's very commonplace Fanon is a doctor. He would treat any patients coming to him. He doesn't have to ask them about their past history, just their current suffering, as we say. So whether they were perpetrators or victims, it's the same. But given the philosophical and intellectual ambition of Fanon, I was wondering whether there was not something more there beyond the mere respect of deontological rules. But did he make a theoretical framework out of that? And then maybe more of a comment about the war in Gaza and the questions asked by Caroline. It was, well, what was emphasized was the barbarisms, the salvage and barbaric attack of the 7th of October. An emphasis was put on Israeli people taking Palestinian children to Israeli hospitals like they were doing individually, a humanitarian action on a daily basis. And then people talked of the incredible ungratefulness of the Palestinians who killed them without mercy. So thinking of colonialism, this form of humanitarianism, including taking Palestinian children to hospitals, isn't it a reproduction of the vertical relationship between the Palestinians and the Israeli people? Because it's a soft form of domination. You know, it's better to take children to a hospital than to their death. But it's still pretty condescending, or it's ambiguous. I'd like to hear what Fanon would think about this through you.
I'll start with the question about his treatment of French soldiers. You know, he spent just 3 years in Algeria. He was there from 53 to 56, and he wouldn't really have had a. First of all, he wouldn't have had a choice. I mean, he treated the people who came to the hospital, and they included French soldiers. And there was only one case in which I think he ceased to treat a soldier, and it was a soldier who was a torturer and who wanted Fanon to teach him how he could continue to practice his tortures without suffering psychological consequences. And I think that that is where Fanon drew the line. And sorry, I cannot help you there. But I do think that Fanon learned a lot from the work that he did with French soldiers. And you can certainly see that in this great chapter that I've alluded to, the last chapter of Les Données de la Terre, where he includes a number of case studies of the French soldiers he worked with, and what he found was that the work of the torturer could very seldom be confined to the torture chamber. That the French soldier who tortured was often extremely aggressive and violent with members of his own family. The French torturer also had to suffer nightmares resulting from these activities. Now, granted, I'm sure there are cases. I'm sure there must have been those who were more skilled at, I guess, what do we call it now, compartmentalizing. But Fanon chose to write about the effects of colonialism on the colonizer and on the torturer. Now, in this, he was, of course, very consistent with the writings of a man who was his mentor in many respects, Aimé Césaire. Césaire and his discourse on colonialism actually emphasized the impact of colonialism on the colonizer as much as on the colonized. He suggested that that the true horror of colonialism resided in the license that it gave to colonizers to express their basest instincts, and in his view, Césaire's view, it was ultimately a kind of boomerang effect. He linked the practice of colonization to the practice to Nazism, right? Nazism, for Césaire, was a kind of internal colonization, where the Nazis applied methods that Europeans had used against people in Madagascar and Algeria and other places. So I do think that Fanon drew something quite useful from his work. It wasn't simply a matter of doing what he had to do. I think he was also interested in the pleasure that certain torturers took in their work. I mean, he placed great emphasis on what he called the exhibitionism of colonial violence. That colonial violence was not just a strategic violence, it was an expressive violence. It was intended to say to the colonized, you need to know your place. So he learned from these encounters. Now, as for the second question, yeah, I would agree with you that that it is a kind of soft domination, right? This practice of charity, and this notion that because we have cared for your children in our hospitals, you should be grateful to us, and you should forget the fact that we have essentially carried out what Baruch Kimmerling, the Israeli sociologist, called politicide, the destruction of a people's national aspirations. Now, of course, politicide has been followed by genocide. I think what some of these commentators, not just Israeli commentators, but European commentators, have overlooked when they refer to the charitable work of some Israelis with respect to children from Gaza or women who have sought to give birth in Israeli hospitals, and like you, I mean, better that they should do these things that they don't. I'm not simply dismissing them, but I think what these commentators overlook is that the vast majority of people in Gaza are the descendants of refugees. They're not Gazans. This is why it's more accurate to call them the people of Gaza rather than les Gazaouis, because most of the people of Gaza actually come from the very communities in southern Israel that were attacked on October 7. And when I say that, I'm not saying that it's somehow, it's a wise practice of anti-colonial violence to slaughter people at a rave. I'm not saying that, but I think that we have to understand the rage, the seething rage of a people who have been kept in the most humiliating of circumstances, and who are looking over the quote-unquote border to the places where they used to live. And although I'm certainly not among those who would celebrate the killing of the people at the rave as as a kind of divine justice, it is rather peculiar at the same time to hold a rave on the border of Gaza. I mean, it is in its own way, and even unknowingly, a provocation. And the fact that, you know, Israeli commentators and supporters of Israel in the West can't see that, and the fact that they imagine that they imagine Israelis in a state of almost of unsullied innocence, I think is a testament to the power of forgetting, you know, and you know, and the reproduction of colonialism, of a colonial society, rests to a large extent on this forgetting, because if you remembered all the time, you know, the utter abnormality and inhumanity of the situation, you wouldn't be able to live.
Thank you very much for having shared this. I was wondering if you could. My name is Carla, and I'm a worker in international corporation. Could you tell us about the Fanon's view on the Martinique society before the Second World War or after, when it was recognized as a French département?
You know, it's so often that Fanon was Martinican, that he was an Antillais, and it's actually crucial to understanding Fanon's work, not just his writing on blackness, not just his writing on the societies of the West Indies, but his understanding of violence, his understanding of anti-colonial struggle, and in fact, his writing, because his writing is permeated by metaphors of the slave plantations of the West Indies. And, you know, as I argue in this book, only a West Indian could have written The Wretched of the Earth. It is a vision of colonial society that is deeply and profoundly West Indian. You know, Fanon imagines the colonized as the slaves of modern times. He's using a language and a vocabulary that I don't think an Algerian writer or a Middle Eastern writer would have used. Fanon had a very complex relationship to Martinique, to say the least. And in fact, Black Skin, White Masks is as much a critique of Antillean society and culture as it is a critique of racism. Fanon had a great envy of Haiti. It seems rather odd to say so, given the terrible suffering that Haitians have experienced, and in a sense the punishment that they have been subjected to for their decision to liberate themselves violently from France. But Fanon regarded the Haitians as having taken possession of themselves, and as having launched a struggle that that brought them a genuine kind of freedom. And in his view, the freedom enjoyed by Martinicans and people of Réunion and Guadeloupe and Guyane, this was a counterfeit freedom because, as he saw it, they hadn't fought for it. They had instead been granted it by the decree of Victor Schellcher in 1848. And for Fanon, this was a great deception. Now, in fairness to the people of Martinique, there were, in fact, slave revolts. There were episodic slave revolts from the early days of Martinique's colonization. But Fanon wasn't terribly aware of those, and He writes in Black Skin, White Mask that one day the white man granted freedom, and that's what freedom had meant. It was something that was given, and Fanon was very much a Hegelian. He felt that if freedom had not been fought for, it really was not worthy of the name. And in Black Skin, White Masks, he is scathing about what he calls this culture of comparaison in Martinique, the way that that Martinicans engage in a kind of brutal rivalry among themselves. He also, of course, writes about the veneration of whiteness. It was something that he was exposed to when he was quite young. His mother would often tell him that he was acting. I mean, his mother would tell him that he was acting like a nègre when he misbehaved, and this is something that that deeply troubled him. When he grew up in Martinique, he thought of himself as white. For Fanon, black people were Africans. They were the tirailleurs sénégalais. His father at one point invited a group of tirailleurs to dinner. At first, Fanon was frightened of them. In fact, Fanon's reaction to the tirailleurs sénégalais was not so different from the reaction that he encountered when he was in France on a train, and a white boy with his mother came up to him and said, "Maman, tiens maman, un nègre, j'ai peur." In a sense, that's how Fanon thought of himself when he was young, and it was only when he was in the French military and when he observed the colonial hierarchy in Morocco, and when he was refused a dance by French women after liberation, it was only then, and particularly after this incident on the train, that he became aware that in the eyes of the French, he and other West Indians were black. And that is what led him to his discovery of negritude, of Senghor, of Césaire, and to the writing of Black Skin, White Masks. Now, there is a very critical literature about Fanon which judges him very harshly for his relationship to Martinique. For example, the Tunisian Jewish writer Albert Memmi, whom Fanon never met, but who left Tunisia just before Fanon got there, wrote 10 years after Fanon died an article called "The Impossible Life of Frantz Fanon." And in that piece, he argued that that Fanon's tragedy was that he never returned to Martinique, and that his real problem was not how to be Algerian. His real problem was how to be a West Indian. His real problem was that he never reconciled himself with his own negritude. And, you know, Albert Memmi, by the time he wrote this article, had become estranged from Arab nationalism. He had become increasingly a Zionist. And so, in a sense, it was a kind of Zionist critique of Frantz Fanon. Fanon should have understood that he needed to go home. He should have joined his brothers and his sisters, his black brothers and his sisters. It was a mistake for him to join these quote-unquote white Africans, the Algerians. This critique, by the way, very interestingly, has been taken up by Afro-pessimists, this school of this new, very influential school of black thought, which is, you know, well represented in American universities, sees Fanon's writing after Black Skin, White Masks as a deviation from Fanon's true essence. In other words, Fanon should have continued writing about and theorizing blackness. He never should have joined the Algerians. That obviously is not my view, and I think, moreover, that it is a mistake to imagine that Fanon, in joining the Algerians, somehow abandoned his Martinican roots. And there's evidence for this. For example, Fanon had a very close relationship to Martinican popular culture, in particular to Martinican music. He would often play the béguines at parties. He spoke about Martinique frequently with Marie-Jeanne Manoilan, his secretary, and he constantly quoted from the poetry of Léon Gontran Damas, Aimé Césaire, Jacques Roumain, and other West Indian writers. The Wretched of the Earth, Les Données de la Terre, owes its title not just to the International, but to a poem by Jacques Roumain. So Fanon, I think, remained very much a West Indian. He was attached to his roots, but he also felt very disappointed. First, because the Martinicans and other West Indians hadn't fought, and secondly, because after 1946, they had accepted the departmentalization of the West Indies under the auspices of Aimé Césaire, who had been, a hero of his, but with whom he had ended up disagreeing very sharply, because Fanon had initially supported departmentalization in 1946. He'd even worked on Aimé Césaire's campaign, but he came to believe that the departmentalization of the islands would reduce them to a state of neocolonialism. And he was very excited when there were when the revolt in Martinique broke out in 1959, and he was close at the time to the young novelist and poet Edouard Glissant, who at the time was a supporter of independence. Glissant, of course, later broke with the idea of independence and developed a whole philosophy based on what he called the poetics of relation and créolité. But at the time, Glissant was a fierce independence supporter. I hope that answers your question.
Laure, je travaille au Crash.
My name is Laura and I work here for the Crash. My question is a bit naive and is a bit of a criticism. I wonder why writing a biography on Fanon. There are other biographies on Fanon that have been written, particularly at a time when there's a risk that he might be turned into an icon, a symbol. And of course, you cannot disconnect his personal life and professional life from what he's written.
Question. But I think that I wrote this book. I have my own personal reasons for writing it, of course, because Fanon touches on a lot of issues that I have explored in my own writing. Even as Michaël was saying, even jazz, because Fanon did have some rather interesting things to say about jazz, which was a form of music he didn't even know all that well. But I wrote the book precisely because I felt that Fanon had never really been written about as a person, as a man. I mean, in Black and White Masks, he writes at one point that his greatest desire is to be seen as a man, not primarily as a black man, simply as a man. And my sense was that no biographer had ever really done that. David Macy wrote a very thorough, very fine, well-researched biography, also published by La Découverte, my publisher here. In fact, I reviewed the book in 2001. But that book is quite arid. It's very scholastic. Fanon never seems very embodied in that book. Alice Cherki, who was Fanon's intern in Blida and who worked with him in Tunisia, wrote a very fine portrait, as she calls it, of Fanon, but it's quite reverential. I mean, it's not that she ignores Fanon's flaws, but on the whole, it's a celebration of Fanon and his life, and again, I didn't really feel that it did justice to the complexity of Fanon, of his contradictions, of the tensions between his practice as a doctor and his work as a revolutionary bureaucrat. And so I thought that I could, for one, illuminate Fanon as a very passionate, very eloquent, very courageous, but also very flawed human being. And also, I wanted to write about Fanon as a writer, and I didn't feel that any of the books really explored his work as a writer and a thinker of considerable, you could almost say, accidental richness, because as I mentioned, he really wasn't writing so much as I mean, these were spoken word performances. You know, Fanon was not someone who sat down and agonized over his sentences. He did not. I mean, he wasn't a writer in that sense, and yet his writings are of accidental inspiration. And I never felt that any of the people who had written on him had done justice to the subtlety and complexity and the vocal qualities of his writing. And so, to me, there was I felt there was a space for a new book that might do justice to those aspects of his life. If someone finds this to be an iconography of Fanon, I would be surprised. I wrote this as a biographer, not as a hagiographer. On the other hand, I can't control how people read my book.
You briefly touched upon the medical practice of Fanon in Tunisia. You've talked a lot about what he did in Algeria, that he had to run away from it at the end of his life. He was a psychiatrist in Tunisia, and he provided care to the some former FLN fighters who ended up in Tunisia, who were not properly managed by the future independent Algeria. And I'm wondering whether his experience at the end of his life treated those who had been injured, you know, who were staying in these camps and in Tunisia, had an influence on his writing.
I think you're alluding to the warnings in The Wretched of the Earth about post-independence and about the potential confiscation of these revolutionary energies by self-interested actors, by the what he called the national bourgeoisie, and I'm not sure that his concerns about the fate of these anti-colonial insurrections were rooted in his work with wounded fighters in training camps in Morocco and Tunisia. I think actually I think that if anything, his experiences with these soldiers helped him to maintain a sense of revolutionary elan, because he by that point had developed a kind of mystique of fighters of rural origin. You know, Fanon romanticized what he thought of as the peasant warriors of Algeria. This was something of an illusion, as I suggest in the book, but he clearly bonded with these fighters, and his role was to care for them until they were able to go back to the front and fight again. And in that regard, he was rather similar to W.H. Rivers, the well-known British psychiatrist, who did the same thing for British soldiers in the First World War. At the same time, he was quite generous with these soldiers. I know this because I have a friend whose father was cared for by Fanon. He had no interest in going back and fighting, and Fanon helped him to come up with excuses so that he didn't have to, and he even gave him money to go to see movies. He in fact advised him to see certain films, mostly art films, and this man who was had no interest in art films would go see westerns, and Fanon knew this but forgave him. I think the concerns that you allude to about the fate of post-independence grew not so much out of his work with the fighters. It grew out of certain deceptions that he observed, and that to some extent he became complicit in once he got to Tunisia. The first of these, of course, was the massacre of civilians who supported the rival MNA in the hamlet of Mekta-Malouza. About 300 villagers were killed there, and Fanon, at his first press conference, claimed that it was a French massacre rather than a massacre ordered by Mohammadi Said, a colonel in the ALN, and Fanon knew this. I don't think that he was under any illusions. And another, I think, even more pivotal case involved the murder of his political mentor in the FLN, Aban Ramdan, who was lured to Morocco by his comrades and who was killed there under the orders of Abdelhafid Boussauf, the leader of the security services, the MALG, which was essentially the spinal cord of the post-war Algerian state. And so, in my view, Fanon's observations about post-independence were shaped by the betrayals within the FLN, and also by what he observed on his travels as an itinerant ambassador in Accra. I mean, he was always very attentive to racism, certainly anti-Black racism among Europeans, but also the anti-Black racism that he observed among Algerians and Tunisians towards himself and towards advocates of African independence. He was very concerned that what he regarded as tribalisms would reemerge after independence because of the failure to create a rich and robust sense of national citizenship. So I think it was really his travels and the betrayals of the FLN that that led to the passages that you're referring to, which are, startling in their prescience, especially given that, he published this book in December of 1961.
Good morning. Ms. Saoud, I'm a consultant, not in the humanitarian field, but I'm very interested in Frantz Fanon as a man encountering history and the opportunity of a radicality. First, what's left of this radicalism and how is it perceived by the descendants of the colonized? Because he's being read, and it's understandable that we would look back at Fanon and in the way he asserted his own radicalism, he didn't fall in the trap of the pathological dynamics of the oppressed and the oppressor in this morbid dialectics. So in what way this novelty and his revolutionary thinking allows us to pull out of this locked situation between the oppressor and the oppressed to go to a real, genuine universalism?
I do think, on some level, you've kind of answered your question. Because I do think that there is a Fanonian spirit in some of today's youth movements, especially in the culture that they're producing. I think we certainly saw it in the early phases of Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying that necessarily persists, but I think that it was there. I think I think you see it in the mobilizations against the war on Gaza. And in fact, I mean, I teach at Bard College, and I don't know how typical Bard College is in this regard, but I saw students who were, reading copies of Wretched of the Earth in their encampments. So they're clearly getting something from him. Now Fanon, I hear it to some extent in the more political iterations of contemporary hip hop. I mean, maybe you're familiar with the anti-colonial anthology Pour les donner de la terre of Rosset, which is this very striking collection of anti-colonial music from the 1960s to the present, from various parts of Africa and the West Indies, various former French colonies. Now, Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks writes that the essence of a revolutionary spirit is the leap of invention, and I do think that I don't know. Again, I'm a middle-aged person now, so I can't represent the youth. But my sense is that there is something is going on with young people who are searching for a kind of new vocabulary by which to emancipate themselves from old categories, whether of race or of sexuality or of gender. And I don't mean to suggest that that's all Fanonian, because how could a revolution in 2024 be Fanonian? The particular conflicts and obstacles that people face are different, and my book is an attempt to historicize Fanon, not to turn him into a guide to understanding the present and to overcoming the injustices of the present. But I think insofar as he was a thinker who engaged with questions that continue to rattle us today. I mean, obviously one of them is, the question of, how do we free ourselves without reproducing the injustices of the past? I think that insofar as he raised those questions, he'll continue to be relevant to us. I mean, let's recall that at the end of Black Skin, White Masks, he writes, was it "Oh mon corps fait de moi un homme qui interroge toujours?" And I think that is an idea that very much resonates with young people. It's really about the questions that he encourages us to continue asking. It's not that he had a particular set of solutions. I mean, for example, does anyone really want to live in a one-party state led by a revolutionary movement anymore? I very much doubt it. I'm not saying. I mean, as corrupt and pathetic and depressing and discouraging as our quote-unquote democracies may be, I don't think that creates any nostalgia for the particular forms that the anti-colonial states assumed in the 1960s. So I don't think Fanon presents us with answers, but he does provoke questions. And I think that's why he'll remain very important. And I think also never to be overlooked is his insistence on the body and on what the body taught him. And I think that insistence on corporeal oppression and on the body's will to resist, I mean, that's at the heart of the movements that we see today. This desire to breathe.
My name is Bruno. I'm a teacher and psychoanalyst. What bothers me about Fanon and what you say is that he doesn't denounce enough the matter of identities. Identities are violent per se, and they always lead to what we see happening like in Gaza, a very violent identity such as Zionism produces something like Hamas. The same happened in Algeria. French colonialism gave rise to something terrible, the FLN, you mentioned the massacres of innocents, and the Algerian power today is anything but, it's far from being democratic. So I think he really pinpointed the trouble with identities.
But I'm not sure that you're reading Fanon very closely, because I do think Fanon is a critic of identity. I mean, for example, I mean, he writes that the black man is not any more than the white man. He in year 5 of the Algerian Revolution, he includes chapters on the European minority and the Jews of Algeria, and he's quite explicit that for him, and again, I mean, this is, alas, something of a mystification, the Algerian nation is a multi-ethnic nation, and anyone who joins the struggle is entitled to be considered an Algerian, including, of course, Fanon himself. I mean, Fanon would write, "We Algerians, nous les Algériens." And I mean, Fanon, of course, was not an Algerian and was never entirely accepted as an Algerian. However, there was a current within the FLN, which I've tried to honor in this book because I think it would be very tempting to forget that it existed, composed of Algerians, both Algerian Muslims and European Algerians, who were progressive and, I mean, I hesitate to use the word laïque because I don't think it's quite the right word, but who were not religious and who believed that that Algeria was a nation in the making and that a free Algeria would be a place for anyone who supported independence. He was not someone who insisted on the inescapability of identity. It's true, of course, that he wrote an essay called The Lived Experience of the Black Man, but it was Fanon's view that if racism were overcome, so would race, because race was the product of racism. Race follows racism, not the reverse. So, I mean, in my view, Fanon actually is a critic of identity. He's not someone who is there to reinforce it or to valorize it. And in fact, Fanon had an exchange with the Iranian thinker Ali Shariati in the late 1950s. Shariati, of course, went on to become a very important influence on the Iranian Revolution. He tried to fuse the energies of anti-colonialism and Shiism. Khomeini was a reader of Shariati, and in an exchange with Fanon, whom he was translating into Persian, Shariati sang the praises of Islam and defended Islam's contribution to the struggle against imperialism, and Fanon acknowledged that, yes, it was true that Islam had played a role that could not be ignored, but that any insistence on religion and religious identity would end up dividing the energies of a movement that ought to be unified around higher goals, not the goals, not around identity or religion. So while I accept your point that that the kind of violent identitarianism produced by French colonialism or by extreme Zionism is not something that a progressive person can get behind, I'm not sure that Fanon would have been a defender of that either. I think rather he would have diagnosed it, understood it in a rather melancholy way, and hoped that something new could be born.
Yeah, and along those lines, I would say the death of Fanon is doubly tragic. He died very young. Also, a huge paradox. He died in the United States of America. He died before the actual independence of Algeria. And the book of Kemral, where he narrates the end of the oppression and the joy in 1962. Fanon died in 61. We have a you know, we read him politically. He is a bit harsh, because he's a thinker of radicality and violence. But in your book, we see a pretty joyful character. He can dance. He loves music. He loves life. And his writings carry some hope. And as we're going through dire times in France currently, with a big focus on racism, anti-Semitism, what's happening today in France is quite unprecedented. It's a pretty somber, dark time. So we need hope. What can you dig out in terms of hope to cheer us up from Fanon's works?
I think I might have to. I think I might have to pass on that question. Yeah, I have a few talents in the world, but giving hope is not among them. I'm sorry. But I do want to comment on something that you said, nevertheless. It's not really an answer to your question, but you said that it was a bit paradoxical that he died in the States because, of course, he called it the country of lynchers. And that's true. And yet his relationship to the States was not simply one of repudiation. It was more ambiguous because, you know, Fanon was very passionate about Black American literature. And many of the examples that he draws upon in Peau Noire, Masque Blanc are from Richard Wright and Chester Himes. They're not even from psychological case studies. And this, in fact, may be, of course, one reason why this book, which was originally intended as a dissertation, was rejected by his supervisors, because it really was not a classical work of psychiatry. It was a kind of a work of cultural studies avant la lettre. And Fanon, in fact, wanted to write a monograph about Richard Wright. He wrote to Richard Wright in 1953, praising his work and hoping that he might get an interview with him. As far as we know, Richard Wright never responded, and about 6 or 7 years later, there appeared in El Mujahid, the FLN newspaper, a scathing review of one of Richard Wright's books on colonialism, which was no doubt written by Fanon. Now, after Fanon's death, he was at risk of being forgotten. We tend to forget that because, you know, as someone else noted, he's now an icon. But he wasn't really widely read on the French left. I mean, there were some people who were still reading him, but people also wanted to move on from the war in Algeria, and it was really in the United States. I mean, I'm putting aside the Latin Americans and Palestinians and so on, but it was in the United States to a large extent that Fanon was resurrected, and he was resurrected by first of all the Black Panthers, who were intrigued not just by his praise of violence. That's a misunderstanding. They were intrigued by his writing about medicine and colonialism, because Black Americans had been subjected to some of the most vicious medical experiments in history, notably the Tuskegee experiments, where a group of Black people were diagnosed with syphilis and they weren't told about it. And then there were Black psychiatrists who were reading his work. In fact, there was a small library at Harvard Medical School that was dedicated to Fanon in the early 1970s. So Fanon's relationship to the States is an interesting one. It was always in the States too that he was taken more seriously as a thinker, and not just as a writer of pamphlets. It's in the United States that here I'm sounding like I'm anything but a patriot. I'm very critical of and yet I'm sounding like one here. It was in the 80s and the 90s that Fanon was was revived in post-colonial studies, both in the States and in Britain. So, I wish I could I mean, I wish I could say something, drawing upon Fanon, to offer hope. Like all of you, I'm very anxious about the state of France, and I think that I'd rather not pontificate on that. But thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Adam.
Many thanks, Adam. I'm sure we would all have many more questions, but we can find answers in your book, Adam, and in Fanon's writings. I encourage you to read Frantz Fanon and to read Adam Shatz's book. You can follow him because he is giving lectures in Paris all week long. Anyway, thank you to all of you. I'm delighted with this conversation we had. And then, well, many thanks again to the sound technician and to the two interpreters, Agnes and Eve. Thank you, Caroline. And many thanks, Adam, for coming to see us.